So I think you guys have waited long enough for a 40 series ITX PC build, and I think this takes that to a completely different level. This is a complete RTX 4080 system that is smaller than the box that the 4080 ships in. It's so small, in fact, that it can fit in a backpack. The 4080 will typically take up about 5% of total space in a compact mid-tower case, but in this build, it's almost a third of the total volume. And believe it or not, there are actually no problems at all with power consumption, cooling, fitment, or anything like that, despite how tight and dense this thing looks. If you've got the right parts, it's actually pretty straightforward to put together. Now, some of you might remember I actually teased this build when I first unboxed the RTX 4090. I did a little bit of a test fit in the Form T1, which is the case that we're using here. It fit, it looked all good, but there was one problem that kind of, prevented me from actually building anything, and it was this thing right here, the default power adapter that ships with these GPUs. Due to how rigid this thing is, along with the insertion angle, it effectively makes the new Founders Edition like a 200mm tall card, which is just irresponsible even for a mid-tower case that's really hard to work with. So that's where a custom cable comes in and saves the day. Basically, this tiny little cable right here is what makes this entire build possible. Without this, don't even bother. This specific cable is from Mod DIY. It's a super flexible 12-volt high-power cable, which plugs directly into the Corsair SF750 via 3 8-pin power connectors. Think of instant noodles that you've accidentally overcooked. That's basically how flexible this cable feels in comparison to the default 16-pin adapter. So basically, we go from not being able to close the bottom panel in the T1 at all to closing it without a problem. And I really mean without a problem. I mean, you don't have to force the panel on or smush any cables down or anything sketchy like that. It's a really comfortable fit. And since it's a custom-made cable, the length is entirely up to you. This one here is 40 centimeters, which turned out to be pretty much spot on. There is also the option of a sleeved cable. This too is pretty flexible and works fine. It does look nicer than the flexible silicone option, but it is a little bit stiffer. Still though, even with this one, the bottom panel closes without a problem if you just route the cables properly. So that, I guess you can say, is catch number one. Catch number two is the fact that we need to run a very slim CPU cooler. We only have 48 mils of CPU cooler height here because we're running such a thick GPU. And I've actually opted for the widest spacing possible in the GPU chamber, which is 3.25 slots, despite running a 3-slot GPU. That way we actually get a tiny bit more space between the flow-through fan and the power supply, and I've created that spacing by mounting the riser cable on the included 5mm standoffs. Now, on the discussion of airflow, we have these two top exhaust fans, which are helping pull air out of the case, and also by creating that negative pressure, it's kind of encouraging air through the side panels as well. Now, that's as opposed to going with a 240mm radiator in this case, which you can actually go with. You can mount a 240mm AIO at the top of the case where we have these fans instead, but there you would actually get worse GPU thermals because you'd be kind of trapping the heat from the GPU. Think of it as kind of like putting a lid over your graphics card. And so the way that I've set up the airflow in this case is basically as much GPU cooling as possible, right? We want that 4080 running as cool and quiet as you possibly can because this form factor is basically just like a shoebox. We've given the GPU 3.25 slots of thickness to work with, so a little bit of extra breathing room. And then we've got these really powerful Fantex T30 fans up top running as exhaust and getting rid of all of that heat within the case. Now, the compromise then of this setup is the CPU, but I'm okay with that because with a 47mm cooler like the Alpenfoam Blackridge, you can still run a Ryzen 5800X 3D under gaming loads, and being one of the fastest gaming CPU options at the moment, there's basically no CPU bottlenecking happening here at all. Now, unfortunately, while the Blackridge cooler is the most effective 47mm cooler that we can be using here, it is not compatible with either the LGA 1700 socket or the AM5 socket, which means both the 13600K and 7600X are out of the question here. So for those CPUs and more power hungry CPUs, you might as well just go with a 240mm liquid cooler with some slim fans up top. That's pretty much the only option, but do expect your GPU thermals to take a hit. So the setup for this build, we've gone with the 5800X 3D, the Asus B550i Strix with the M.2 heatsink removed. We've got some low profile memory and the Blackridge cooler with the fan swapped to a slim 92mm fan from Noctua. The only other part here in this build is the power supply, where I've gone with the Corsair SF750 Platinum. And with the actual power draw of the 4080 being below 300 watts, there just aren't any problems here. 750 watts with an 80 plus platinum rating seems to be coping just fine, especially when paired with the Ryzen 5800X 3D, which at most pulls around 100 watts. In gaming loads, in fact, I saw it closer to that 70 to 80 watt range, which is really impressive. This thing just sips power. And so here it is, the finished build. At just 10 liters in total volume, I mean, what a monster. The density of this thing is just ridiculous. And the new Founders Edition card looks like it was made to fit in this specific case, both physically but also aesthetically. It kind of just looks like an extension of the case itself. Like if you saw this titanium T1 from the outside and opened up the side panel, I feel like this is kind of what you would just almost expect to find on the inside. Same goes for that Black Ridge cooler. I mean, I've always loved this thing. It's just pure density and performance, with the total height just skimming the mesh side panel. And the performance as well is really damn good. After about 40 minutes of Firmark, the 4080 topped out at just 64C with a room ambient temp of 22, and that was with the fans running stock at 1300 to 1400 RPM. This is with no undervolting, no power limit reductions or any interventions like that, just the 4080 casually running the most demanding thing it can run, and doing that here in the T1 without a sweat. I'll also note that I'm using a software called Fan Control, which you guys actually recommended. I had no idea this existed, believe it or not, but with this software you can control those top two exhaust fans based off of the temperature of the GPU. So as the GPU starts heating up, those top two fans also just start automatically helping out. That's not something that you can do within the motherboard BIOS. And yeah, with those top two fans running at around 1300 RPM, they seem to be having a pretty decent impact. Lots of heat being dumped outside of the top of the case, and here's an idea of how the build sounds at full load. I think we'd all agree that's a pretty good result for such a compact 4080 build, and keep in mind that represents worst case. Firmark pushes the 4080 to around 300 watts, but most games, even at 4K, will push it to around the 250 to 280 watt range. Especially if you're playing at 1440p, expect a few degrees lower and a bit quieter than what you just saw. So really happy with how the 4080 is running in there, but the big question now is, what about the 4090? I mean, after all, they both occupy the same space, they both have the exact same cooler, so fitting them in here is pretty much identical. At the same time, the 4090 pulls about 100 to 150 watts more than the 4080, which is quite a big chunk, and so more heat load across the same cooler design. The results are about what you would expect. The 4090 runs a tad over 70 degrees, with the fans running at around 1500 RPM. Compared to the 4080 setup, that's plus 8 degrees and plus 200-ish RPM on the fans, so it's a louder, warmer configuration, but surprisingly still pretty viable. I mean, 72 degrees here in Firmark, that's really good considering the form factor. It is noticeably louder though than what we had with the 4080. But again, if we're testing actual games here and not just blasting Firmark for an extended period, the noise and temperatures are much better. Control at 4K with ray tracing, for example, saw the 4090 around that 360 watt and 67 degree mark, and Doom Eternal, also at 4K with ray tracing, was less than that again. Also, the Ryzen 5800X 3D is coping absolutely fine, as you can see, and the temperatures that you're seeing here are actually pretty typical Ryzen 5000 CPU gaming temperatures. This is also helped by the fact that the CPU and GPU are in complete separate chambers. They're not really sharing any heat, which is really nice. Even in Overwatch 2 at 1440p, which is pretty CPU bound at 600 FPS, there are no issues with the CPU at all. Now, the only part of this entire build that I'm not super happy with is the fan on the Black Ridge cooler. It has a high pitch noise above 70% fan speed. I think it's because the fan is sitting too close to the heatsink, which you could probably correct with a knock to a foam pad, which I'm going to try in a future video. Now, the other really cool thing with this build is that it should also be compatible with AMD's upcoming 7900 XT and XTX. Those are smaller cards in every dimension, and the claimed power levels are lower. So that should be pretty exciting, and I'll give you guys an update when those GPUs actually release. So yeah, I'm actually pretty thrilled overall with this build. I think it's quite outstanding, although I can't actually recommend the 4090 setup unless you're willing to take that compromise when it comes to noise and temperatures, when it comes to 4K gaming. I am kind of interested in running this as my main personal system. As some of you know, I'm using a 12900K and a 3090 in a water-cooled end case at the moment. So this would be an upgrade when it comes to the GPU. Now I have to say, I'm not going to be giving up that end case build very easily. You know, I put a lot of work into it. It's served me very well. It runs super quiet and it's just a very super reliable PC. There are a couple of things I want to change. I'd love a bit more storage, but in terms of the GPU performance and the CPU performance, it's meeting most of the demand that I'm putting it through. Now, of course, more performance is always better. If I can get faster video exports, if I can get, better video playback, that's always welcome. So I'm definitely going to test the two back to back and see if this is worth upgrading to. So I guess expect a follow-up video very soon. But that's pretty much it. Hopefully you all enjoyed. If you want to put something like this together, I'll have some links down below where you can check out some of the parts. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.